North Cascades National Park is a U.S. national park located in the state of Washington. The park is the largest of the three National Park Service units that comprise the North Cascades National Park Service Complex. Several national wilderness areas and British Columbia parkland adjoin the national park. The park features rugged mountain peaks and protects portions of the North Cascades Range. Human history. Paleo-Indians and Native Americans. Human history in the region, now part of North Cascades National Park, dates back to the end of the last glacial period, and the region has been continuously inhabited for at least the last 8–10,000 years. At the time, Native American ancestors of Skagit tribes slowly advanced from Puget Sound into the interior mountainous region as the glacial ice retreated. Archaeological evidence of continuous human presence in the North Cascades dates to 4470 B.C., and rocks procured from sources in the region were used to manufacture stone tools and weapons for several millennia. Hosomine chert, a type of rock well suited to the fabrication of implements, was mined from near Hosomine Mountain, just east of the park border. For the last 8,400 years, Hosomine chert is part of the archaeological record throughout the Skagit River Valley, west of the park and in regions to the east, indicating people visited the region if for no other purpose than to obtain raw materials. Prehistoric microblades dating back to 9,600 years before present have been discovered at Cascade Pass, a mountain pass that connects the western lowlands to the interior regions of the park and the Stehekin River Valley. The microblades are part of an archaeological assemblage that includes 5 distinct cultural periods, indicating that people were traveling into the mountains nearly 10,000 years ago. The archaeological excavation at Cascade Pass is one of the 260 prehistoric sites that have been identified in the park. When white explorers first entered the area in the late 18th century, perhaps 1,000 Skagits lived there. The Skagits lived in settlements, culling the needs from the waterways and traveling by way of canoe. Skagits formed a loose confederation of tribes that united if threatened by outside tribes such as the Haidas, who lived to the north. They erected large houses or lodges that might house multiple families, each with their own partitioned area and entrance. The lodges were 100 feet in length and 20 to 40 feet in width, and the roofs were shed styles, with a single pitch. Structures built by other Puget Sound tribes usually had gable roofs with more than one pitch. The Skagits were generally lowlanders, who only ventured into the North Cascades during the summer months, and structures in the mountains were more modest, consisting mostly of temporary buildings erected with poles and covered with branches. The Skagits erected totem poles and participated in potlatch ceremonies, similar to the Haidas, but with less complexity and extravagance. By 1910, only about 56 Skagits remained in the region, but the numbers have since rebounded some. Inland and residing to the north and east of the Skagits, the Nyakapamiks, Chelan, Okanagan and Wenatchee tribes lived partly a year-round in the eastern sections of the North Cascades. The Skagits and Thompsons often had disputes, and raided each other's camps in search of slaves to exact retributions. Like the coastal-based Skagits, inland tribes also constructed long lodges which were occupied by numerous families, though the style of construction was slightly different, as the lodges did not have partitions separating one family from another, and were frame constructed and covered with reed mats rather than from cedar planking. One Wenatchee lodge was described by Thompson as being 240 40 feet long. Inland tribes were more likely to travel on foot or horseback than by canoe since the inland regions were less densely forested. Inland tribes also had less bountiful fisheries and greater weather extremes due to being further away from the moderating influence of the Pacific Ocean. Additionally, inland tribes rarely erected totem poles or participated in potlatch ceremonies. By the beginning of the 20th century, inland tribes, like the coastal neighbors, had much reduced populations from when they had first encountered white explorers 100 years earlier, mostly due to smallpox and other diseases. Modern exploration. The earliest white explorer to enter the North Cascades was most likely a Scotsman named Alexander Ross in 1811, who was in the employ of the Pacific Fur Company, an American-owned company. To the southeast of the modern park boundary, Ross and other members of the company constructed Fort Okanagan in 1811, as a base to operate from during the early period of the Pacific Northwest fur trade. Fort Okanagan was the first American settlement in present-day Washington, and well north of the route followed by members of the Lewis and Clark expedition of 1804 to 1806, and also north of Fort Vancouver, which was on the Columbia River. Fort Okanagan was later owned by the Northwest Company and then the Hudson's Bay Company, both of which were British-owned. Much of the trade in furs was conducted between Native American and a few white trappers at trading posts staffed by representatives of the Fur Trading Company. In one season alone, Ross traded for 1,500 beaver pelts. In 1814, Ross became the first known white explorer to cross the major peaks of the North Cascades, but he was less interested in exploration than in simply attempting to discover a route which would easily connect the fur posts of interior Washington with Puget Sound to the west. Ross was accompanied by 3 Indians, one of which was a guide who led the party to a high pass in the North Cascades. Ross and the guide may have traveled as far west as the Skagit River, but failed to get to Puget Sound. Fur trading slowed considerably as demand for furs decreased in the 1840s, but a few residents continued to at least augment their income by trapping for furs in the future park until 1968, when the park was established, rendering the activity illegal. Aside from isolated trappers, the North Cascades saw no explorations until the 1850s. In 1853, U.S. Army Captain George B. McClellan led a party that explored for potential places that a railroad could be built through the region. McClellan determined that the mountains were too numerous and precipitous and that any railway would have to be constructed well south of the current park. American and British disputes in the region centered on the fur trade, and the Treaty of 1818 allowed for joint administration of Oregon Country, as it was referred to in the U.S. The British Empire referred to the region as the Columbia District. The treaty set the international boundary at the 49th parallel, but this was not as clear west of the Rocky Mountains, since the rival fur trading outfits had their own ideas about where the boundary should be. The Oregon boundary dispute between Britain and the U.S. eventually led to the Oregon Treaty of 1846, and the 49th parallel forms both the current international boundary as well as the northern border of the current park. During the late 1850s, members of the U.S. Northwest Boundary Commission explored the boundary region, attempting to identify which mountains, rivers and lakes belonged to which country. One party of the commission was led by explorer Henry Custer, and they explored much of the northern district of the park, publishing the report in the 1860s. Custer's party crossed Whatcom Pass in 1858 and were the first whites to see Challenger Glacier and Hozomene Mountain. So impressed with the scenic grandeur of the region, Custer succinctly stated, must be seen, it cannot be described. During the explorations by Custer, gold was discovered in a quartz vein on the slopes of El Dorado Peak. In 1882, U.S. Army Lt. Henry Hubbard Pierce led a government-sponsored exploration that traversed along the western boundary of the southern section of the current park, in search of transportation routes and natural resources. As had been true for the party led by McClellan in the 1850s, Pierce failed to find a suitable route for a railway, and only marginally suitable routes for roads. Further expeditions by the military in 1883 and 1887 also determined that the mountains were virtually impenetrable. Explorers continued to seek out routes for wagon roads and railways, and by the end of the 19th century much of the park had been explored. But it wasn't until 1972 that the North Cascades Highway finally bisected the mountains. Mining, logging and dam construction. Prospectors had entered the North Cascades by the 1850s. Placer mining first started along the banks of the Skagit River. In the 1870s, placer mining also commenced along Ruby Creek, and hundreds of miners flocked to the region even though it was difficult to access. Most mining activity along Ruby Creek had ended by the 1880s but was soon replaced by hard rock mining for silver and other minerals. This second period of mining lasted from the 1890s to the 1940s but was only marginally more lucrative. Miners were hampered by short working seasons, difficult terrain, low quantities of ore and a lack of financial investments. Miners built many of the first trails and roads into portions of the backcountry, some that involved intricate engineering, including bridges over the numerous streams and dynamiting rock ledges above steep gorges during trail construction. One mining company built a series of flumes, the longest of which was over 3 miles, to both transport lumber and to supply water for use in the hydraulic mining operation. During the latter years of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, larger-scale mining companies mined silver and lead in addition to gold, mostly for little to no profitability. The demand for various metals was not constant, so prices tended to fluctuate too much for mining to be viable. Once the region became a national park, some privately owned mining in-holdings remained. One such in-holding, the Thunder Creek Mine, was still privately owned as of 1997. Unlike many other regions of the Pacific Northwest, logging had little major impact on the future park. The ruggedness of the terrain and the existence of more economically viable timber resources which were closer to transportation routes, largely dissuaded the timber industry from logging in the area. In 1897, the Washington Forest Reserve was set aside, essentially preserving the forestland that would later become the park. By 1905, the management of the reserve was transferred from the U.S. Department of the Interior to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the U.S. Forest Service was subsequently created to administer these forest reserves nationwide, which were redesignated as national forests, though the Department of Agriculture allowed commercial enterprises the right to log the forest with a permit. Most of the timber taken from the region was used only locally for the construction of cabins and similar small-scale enterprises. Logging expanded when the Skagit River hydroelectric project was commenced by the public utility Seattle City Light in the 1920s. Almost 12,000 acres of timber would have been left underwater by the completion of the Ross Dam. A contract to extract the timber was awarded in 1945, and the project was not completed until 1958. None of the dams or areas that were extensively logged are within the current boundaries of the national park, but they are in the adjoining Ross Lake National Recreation Area. establishing the national park. The establishment of Yellowstone National Park in 1872 and Yosemite National Park in 1890 led preservationists to argue for similar protections for other areas in the U.S. Even before the North Cascade region was provided some protection when it was designated a forest reserve in 1897. Activists argued that the region should be afforded the greater protection accorded from a national park designation. A petition was submitted in 1892 by Washington state citizens to establish National Park to the north of Lake Chelan, as many who had visited the region believed it to have scenery greater than Switzerland's. Further efforts surfaced in 1906 and again in the years between 1916 and 1921, when several bills to designate the region a national park failed to get ratification from the U.S. Congress. Not all locals supported the idea of a national park, as they felt that such a designation would negatively impact their economic situation. The U.S. Forest Service was also not in favor of a park, as that would mean they would have to relinquish control over the land, an event that was not uncommon since many parks that were being established were originally managed by the Forest Service. In an effort to appease the detractors, the U.S. Forest Service designated primitive areas which would provide increased protections to some of the most pristine regions they managed. By the mid-1930s, Forester Bob Marshall argued that the region should be set aside as wilderness, as that would keep the National Park Service out, since the mandate would force them to construct roads and build improvements for the sake of tourism. Rival interests continued to argue over whether the lands should remain under the management of the U.S. Forest Service or the National Park Service, but by the 1960s, the environmentalist argument advocating for a national park prevailed. Though the North Cascades National Park Act designated the region as a national park on October 2, 1968, the National Park Service did not commence direct management until January 1, 1969. The North Cascades National Park Act also designated Ross Lake and Lake Chelan National Recreation Areas. Redwood National Park in California was also signed into existence on the same day as the North Cascades. By 1988, much of Bob Marshall's original plan to set aside the future park as wilderness was achieved when 93% of North Cascades National Park was designated as the Stephen Mather Wilderness. Park management. North Cascades National Park is managed by the National Park Service and the park headquarters is in Sedro-Woolley, Washington. The park consists of a northern and a southern district unit. These are separated by Ross Lake National Recreation Area. The southeast boundary of the Southern District abuts Lake Chelan National Recreation Area. The park and two recreation areas are managed as the North Cascades National Park Complex. The three entities were all established in 1968 and in 1988 much of the park complex was designated wilderness as the Stephen Mather Wilderness, preventing further non-natural alterations to 93% of the park. The mandate of the National Park Service is to preserve and protect natural and cultural resources. The Organic Act of August 25, 1916, established the National Park Service as a federal agency. One major section of the Act has often been summarized as the mission to promote and regulate the use of the national parks, which purpose is to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. Quote, In keeping with this mandate, hunting is illegal in the park, as is mining, logging and removal of natural or cultural resources. Additionally, oil and gas exploration and extraction are not permitted. In 2013, North Cascades National Park recorded over 21,000 visitors, but adjoining Ross Lake National Recreation Area reported over 725,000 visitors, and Lake Chelan National Recreation Area had just under 40,000 visitors. Peak visitation is between the months of June and September. The vast majority of visitors come to Ross Lake National Recreation Area, which is easily accessible on Washington State Route 20, also known as the North Cascades Highway, and the only road which bisects the park complex. North Cascades National Park Complex had an operating base budget of $7,700,000 for fiscal year 2010, augmented by another $3,700,000 of non-base funding, which can fluctuate significantly from year to year, and additional funding from revenue generated from concessionaire contracts and user fees. Much of the budget is for staffing, with 83% directed to pay for the employ of 81 permanent employees, not all of which are employed year-round, and the nearly 250 seasonal and term employees that work primarily in the summer months. The North Cascades National Park Complex management activities include facilities management, which oversees the maintenance and construction of roads, 396 miles of trails and 260 buildings, and resource management, which is involved in areas as diverse as fire management, biological resource management, and glacier monitoring. Park employees also provide law enforcement, search and rescue, medical response, interpretive services, and educational outreach, and the administrative division, which oversees budgets, personnel, and contracting services.